Professor Zix-427 gazed through the crystalline walls of his office at the swirling nebula beyond, his four retractable eyes focusing and unfocusing in a pattern that indicated deep satisfaction. The Galactic Institute of Higher Learning's central spire floated serenely among the stars, its quantum-locked position providing the perfect vantage point for contemplating his latest academic innovation. The professor's iridescent scales shifted from their usual scholarly purple to a confident gold as he reviewed the final calculations on his neural display. After 3 centuries of teaching advanced problem-solving to the galaxy's brightest minds, he had finally developed the perfect test, one that would definitively prove the superiority of structured logical thinking over all other methodologies. The soft chime of his office door interrupted his reverie. "Enter," he commanded, his translator converting the complex harmonics of his native speech into standard galactic basic. Sarah Chen walked in, her human frame looking surprisingly at ease in the low-gravity environment. Despite her species' relatively recent arrival on the galactic stage, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that had become frustratingly typical of human students. "You wanted to see me, Professor?" Sarah asked, adjusting the simple paper notebook she always carried, an archaic affectation that never failed to irritate him. How she had managed to maintain her position at the top of his class while rejecting neural interfaces and quantum mnemonic enhancement remained a mystery. "Indeed, Student Chen, I wanted to inform you personally about tomorrow's announcement. As this year's highest-performing student, you deserve advance notice." His secondary speaking membrane vibrated with barely contained excitement. "The Institute has approved my proposal for a revolutionary new testing methodology." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, another peculiarly human expression he had never quite decoded. "What kind of test, Professor?" "A survival simulation," he announced, causing all 4 of his eyes to focus on her face to observe her reaction. "One that will challenge students to escape from an increasingly hostile environment using only their problem-solving abilities. The simulation will adapt to each species' natural capabilities, ensuring perfect fairness." "Sounds interesting," Sarah replied, making those strange marking motions in her notebook. "Any particular reason for the new format?" The professor's scales rippled with academic fervor. "The galaxy is changing, Student Chen. With humanity's recent inclusion in the Galactic Council, there has been much debate about different approaches to problem-solving. Some suggest that your species' rather chaotic methods have merit." He managed to keep most of the disdain from his harmonics. "This test will provide empirical data on the relative effectiveness of various cognitive approaches." Sarah's lips curved upward in what humans call a smile. "So it's a competition. A standardized evaluation," he corrected. "Each student will face challenges calibrated to their species' capabilities. The simulation's quantum processors will ensure perfect equity. And what happens if we fail?" The professor's scales shifted to a reassuring blue. "Nothing harmful, I assure you. The simulation is completely safe. However, failure to complete the challenges within the allotted time will result in an automatic failing grade for this semester." Sarah made another note, then asked, "Any hints about what we should prepare for?" "That would defeat the purpose," the professor replied. "The simulation will test pure problem-solving ability, not memorized responses. Though I suggest you reconsider your rejection of neural interfaces. The challenges will be demanding." "I'll stick with my notebook, thanks." Sarah stood, tucking her primitive writing implement behind her ear. "Is there anything else, Professor?" He waved a dismissive appendage. "That will be all. I look forward to analyzing your performance data." As Sarah left his office, Professor Zix-427's scales returned to their confident gold. He had designed the simulation's logic gates himself, incorporating 3 centuries of teaching experience. Every variable had been accounted for, every possible solution pathway mapped. It would finally prove that proper, structured approaches to problem-solving were superior to humanity's random intuitive leaps. The next morning, The Institute's grand lecture hall hummed with nervous energy as students from a dozen species gathered for the announcement. Crystalline symmetrians vibrated in geometric patterns of anticipation. Quantum phase Altharians flickered through probability states. Even the normally stoic hive mind representatives showed signs of agitation through their pheromone patterns. Professor Zix 427 took his place at the lectern, his scales now a dramatic shade of ceremonial crimson. As he explained the survival simulation, his primary speaking membrane swelled with pride at the gasps and murmurs that rippled through the audience. Only Sarah Chen remained still, quietly making notes while everyone around her accessed neural databases and ran probability calculations. The simulation begins tomorrow, the professor concluded. You will enter individually, in randomly assigned order. Remember, you have 12 standard hours to escape. After that, the simulation ends automatically with a failing grade. As the students filed out, already forming study groups and sharing quantum data packets, Sarah approached the lectern. Quick question, Professor. Will we be able to bring anything into the simulation with us? Only your natural abilities, he replied. The environment will provide everything needed to solve the challenges. Sarah nodded, made one final note, and left the hall. The professor watched her go, noting how she stopped to observe the hall's architecture on her way out. Probably another irrelevant human habit, he decided. Tomorrow would prove once and for all that such undisciplined behavior had no place in advanced problem-solving. In his 3 centuries of teaching, Professor Zix 427 had never been more certain of anything. He had also never been more wrong. The simulation chamber dominated the heart of the Institute's testing center, its quantum-reinforced walls stretching up into darkness. As Professor Zix 427 conducted the final systems check, holographic displays danced around him, reflecting off his scales in complex patterns. Each line of code, each security protocol, represented decades of careful planning. Behind him, a line of anxious students waited for their pre-simulation briefing. The symmetrians had arranged themselves in perfect geometric formations, their crystalline bodies humming with calculated frequencies. The Altharians existed in multiple probability states simultaneously, preparing for every possible scenario. Even the hive mind representatives had linked into a strategic planning matrix. Sarah Chen stood at the end of the line, still making notes in that primitive notebook. The professor's tertiary eye twitched at the sight. She hadn't even accepted the neural interface upgrade offered to all human students. The simulation's parameters are simple, he began, his scales shifting to lecture mode Azure. You will find yourself in a series of 5 interconnected challenge zones. Each zone presents escalating survival scenarios requiring complex problem-solving. You must reach the exit point within 12 standard hours. A holographic display materialized, showing the simulation's basic structure. Zone 1 tests environmental adaptation. Zone 2 challenges quantum mechanics comprehension. Zone 3 examines multi-dimensional reasoning. Zone 4 evaluates temporal paradox resolution. The final zone combines all previous elements with additional variables. The Altharians' probability fields pulsed with approval. This was exactly the kind of structured challenge they excelled at. The Symmetrians had already begun calculating optimal solution paths, their crystalline forms refracting light in complex mathematical sequences. Remember, the professor continued, the simulation adapts to each species' natural capabilities. A solution possible for a Symmetrian might be impossible for an Altharian, and vice versa. The system will ensure perfect equity. A hive mind representative raised a sensory appendage. Query: are cooperative solutions permitted? Negative. This is an individual assessment. Any attempt to network or share consciousness will trigger immediate failure. The professor's scales rippled with satisfaction as the hive mind representatives reluctantly dissolved their strategic matrix. What about out-of-box thinking? Sarah asked, not looking up from her notebook. The professor's scales flickered briefly to irritated orange. The simulation accounts for all valid solution paths, Student Chen. Random actions will only waste time. Sarah nodded, making another note. The professor noticed she had drawn what appeared to be the simulation chamber's architectural layout, with annotations he couldn't quite read from his position. "Your entry times have been randomly assigned," he announced, sending the schedule to everyone's neural interfaces, and one primitive data pad for Sarah. "First participant enters in 1 standard hour. I suggest you use this time for final preparations." The students dispersed, each species following their traditional pre-challenge rituals. The Symmetrians began their probability harmonization routines. The Altharians split into multiple temporal states to maximize preparation efficiency. The hive mind representatives entered their individual meditation pods. Sarah, however, walked slowly around the simulation chamber's perimeter, occasionally stopping to press a hand against its quantum-reinforced walls or glance up at its architecture. The professor watched her with his secondary eyes while continuing system checks with his primary pair. "Seeking structural weaknesses is pointless, Student Chen," he called out. "The chamber is perfectly secure." "Just admiring the craftsmanship, Professor," she replied, making another note. "Someone put a lot of thought into this design. 3 centuries of academic experience went into this system," he said proudly. "Every variable has been accounted for, every possible solution pathway mapped. It is, if I may say, perfect." Sarah smiled that peculiar human smile again. "Nothing's perfect, Professor. That's what makes things interesting." Before he could respond, his neural interface alerted him that the first participant was ready to begin. The professor pushed his irritation aside and began the startup sequence. Soon, data would prove what he had always known, that proper, structured approaches to problem-solving were superior to humanity's chaotic methods. As the first student entered the chamber, Sarah sat cross-legged in a corner, flipping back through her notebook. The professor noticed she had filled several pages with drawings and notes during his briefing. What a waste of time, he thought. In 12 hours, when she faced the simulation's challenges, no amount of primitive mark-making would help her navigate his perfectly designed system. The simulation chamber hummed to life, its quantum processors spinning up to full capacity. On his neural display, the professor watched as the first participant was embedded into the virtual environment. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Soon, he would have irrefutable proof of his teaching method's superiority. Above them, unnoticed by anyone except Sarah, the chamber's architectural support beams cast interesting shadows in the ambient light. She made one final note in her notebook, then closed it with a satisfied nod. The professor might have been concerned if he had seen what she wrote, but he was too busy monitoring the simulation's startup sequence to pay attention to such primitive behavior. The test had begun, and with it, a chain of events that would challenge everything Professor Zix-427 thought he knew about problem-solving, intelligence, and the nature of perfection itself. Hour after hour, Professor Zix-427 watched as each student entered the simulation chamber. The Symmetrians performed admirably, their crystalline minds methodically working through each challenge. Most escaped within 10 hours, though none managed better than 8. The Altharians' quantum phase abilities gave them slight advantages in certain zones, yet they too averaged 9 hours for completion. The hive mind representatives struggled without their collective consciousness, several failing to escape before the 12-hour deadline. Each failure caused the professor's scales to ripple with scientific satisfaction. The data was proving his theories about the superiority of individual logical processing. Student Chen, his voice harmonics carried across the waiting area. "You're next." Sarah closed her notebook and stood, stretching casually as if preparing for nothing more important than a routine exercise. The professor noted with disapproval that she had spent the entire waiting period making more drawings and notes instead of running neural simulations like the other students. "Any last-minute advice, Professor?" she asked, approaching the chamber entrance. His scales shifted to a pedagogical blue. "Follow the logical progression of challenges. Don't waste time attempting random solutions. The simulation rewards structured thinking." "We'll see," Sarah replied, stepping into the chamber. As the quantum field activated around her, she pulled her pencil from behind her ear and tucked it into her pocket. A puzzling action, since no physical objects would transfer into the virtual environment. The professor initiated the startup sequence, his neural interface connecting directly with the simulation's monitoring systems. The virtual environment materialized around Sarah. Zone 1, the Environmental Adaptation Challenge. Most students spent at least 2 hours here, learning to navigate the constantly shifting landscape. Sarah looked around the crystalline maze, its walls rearranging themselves according to complex algorithmic patterns. Then she did something unexpected. She sat down. The professor's scales flickered with confusion. "Student Chen, the challenge requires you to." "I know, Professor," she interrupted, closing her eyes. "I'm listening." "Listening to what?" "The environment is purely visual." But even as he spoke, he noticed something odd in the data stream. Sarah's position, though stationary, was causing subtle variations in the maze's reconfiguration patterns. After exactly 3 minutes, she stood and walked purposefully toward the nearest wall. Just before she reached it, the algorithmic pattern shifted, opening a passage. She turned left, then left again, each time arriving at an opening milliseconds after it appeared. The professor's scales rippled with disbelief as Sarah reached Zone 1's exit in just 17 minutes. The previous record had been 1 hour and 43 minutes. Zone 2's quantum mechanics challenge proved even more surprising. Instead of attempting to solve the complex probability equations that had occupied the Altharians for hours, Sarah simply walked through the quantum field as if she could see the correct path. The professor frantically checked his instruments. No, she wasn't using any technology to map the quantum states. She was just walking. "Impossible," he muttered, his scales shifting to agitated crimson. She must be exploiting the system flaw. But his diagnostics showed no anomalies. The simulation was functioning perfectly. Zone 3's multidimensional reasoning tests had reduced several students to tears. Sarah treated it like a pleasant stroll, humming to herself as she navigated the impossibly folded spaces. She didn't even pause to calculate the geometric progressions that the symmetrians had spent hours analyzing. In Zone 4, where temporal paradoxes had confused even the most brilliant minds, Sarah moved with absolute confidence. She didn't attempt to solve the paradoxes at all. She simply avoided them, as if she could see exactly where and when not to be. The professor's agitation grew with each passing minute. This wasn't just unexpected. It violated fundamental principles of problem-solving. No one could navigate these challenges without performing the necessary calculations. It was mathematically impossible. Yet there she was, approaching the final zone after only 43 minutes. The professor's scales had turned an unprecedented shade of confused mauve. The fastest completion time so far had been 8 hours and 12 minutes. This wasn't just breaking the curve, it was destroying it. "Student Chen," he called out, his harmonics strained. "Explain your methodology." Sarah glanced up at the virtual ceiling, directly at his observation point, though that should have been impossible. "Remember what you said about the simulation adapting to each species' natural capabilities, Professor. Of course, it ensures perfect fairness by—" He stopped, his 4 eyes widening as understanding began to dawn. "Exactly," Sarah said, that curious human smile playing across her face. "It adapts to what it expects each species to be capable of. But has anyone ever tested what humans are actually capable of?" Before the professor could respond, Sarah stepped into the final zone. What happened next would be discussed in academic circles for centuries to come. The professor's perfect system was about to encounter something it had never been programmed to handle: human intuition unbounded by artificial limitations. His scales shifted to alarmed ultraviolet as Sarah began to move through the final challenge in ways that defied every known problem-solving algorithm. The next few minutes would change his understanding of intelligence forever. The final zone was Professor Zix 427's masterpiece, a constantly shifting labyrinth that combined all previous challenges while adding new variables. Environmental hazards merged with quantum uncertainties, multi-dimensional spaces twisted through temporal paradoxes. It was designed to be solvable, but only through careful analysis and methodical progression. Sarah Chen took one look at it and laughed. The professor's scales cycled through colors so rapidly that his monitoring systems triggered a health alert. "Student Chen, what could possibly be amusing about this situation?" "It's beautiful, Professor," she replied, walking forward into the chaos. "You've created something amazing here, but you've made one fundamental mistake." "Impossible," he stated, but his harmonics wavered. "Every variable has been accounted for, every possibility mapped." "That's exactly the mistake." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her pencil, which should have been impossible. No physical objects were supposed to transfer into the simulation. You mapped every logical possibility, but humans don't think in maps. The professor's neural interfaces flooded with warning signals as Sarah began to move through the final zone. She wasn't solving the challenges, she was ignoring them entirely. Where quantum probability fields should have blocked her path, she simply walked through as if they didn't exist. When temporal paradoxes tried to trap her in recursive loops, she somehow stepped between the moments. "Stop," the professor commanded. "You're violating fundamental laws of physics." "No," Sarah replied calmly, twirling her impossible pencil between her fingers. "I'm violating the laws of physics as your simulation defines them. But your definitions are based on assumptions about how problems must be solved." Around her, the virtual environment began to glitch. Reality flickered as the quantum processors struggled to compute solutions for problems that Sarah wasn't even attempting to solve. She was neither fighting the system nor hacking it. She was simply refusing to accept its limitations. Other students who had completed their attempts gathered around the monitoring stations, drawn by the unprecedented data patterns. The Symmetrians vibrated in disharmonious confusion. The Altharians' probability fields collapsed into single states of shocked observation. Even the hive mind representatives fell silent. But how? The professor's scales had settled into a pale shade of academic crisis. The simulation adapts to each species' capabilities. It should be impossible for you to exceed its parameters. Sarah paused in her casual stroll through chaos, that familiar smile playing across her face. "That's the beauty of it, Professor. You programmed the simulation to adapt to what you believe humans are capable of. But humans have a special talent. We don't accept predetermined limitations. We see boundaries as suggestions." As if to demonstrate, she used her pencil to draw out a door in the air. To the professor's horror, the mark remained hanging in virtual space, a two-dimensional sketch that somehow cast a three-dimensional shadow. Sarah reached for the roughly drawn doorknob. "You can't," the professor protested. "That's not a valid solution pathway." "Why not?" Sarah asked, turning the impossible doorknob. "Because it doesn't follow the rules. Rules are just humanity's best guess about how things work. When we find something that doesn't fit the rules, we don't assume we're wrong. We assume the rules are incomplete." The door opened. Through it, the professor could see the simulation's exit point, which should have been unreachable without completing all intervening challenges. His perfect system was being undone not by force or cleverness, but by simple human refusal to accept its constraints. "But this is chaos," he exclaimed, his scales now a deep philosophical purple. If everyone ignored established solution parameters, nothing would make sense. Sarah stepped through her hand-drawn door. "Chaos is just order we don't understand yet. Humans have learned to be comfortable with that uncertainty. It's not a weakness, Professor. It's our greatest strength." The simulation's quantum processors overloaded, trying to compute the paradox of a solution that existed outside their predetermined possibility space. Reality stuttered, fractaled, and began to break down. Sarah walked calmly through the disintegrating virtual environment, reached the exit point, and pressed her hand against it. Total system time, 58 minutes and 23 seconds. As the simulation collapsed around her, Sarah pulled out her notebook and made one final note. The professor, his scales now an unprecedented shade of paradigm-shifting iridescence, managed to ask one last question. "What have you been writing all this time?" Sarah held up the notebook, showing him pages filled with sketches of the simulation chamber's architecture, the quantum processor layouts, and the energy distribution systems. "I was learning to see how your perfect system worked, Professor, because once you understand the rules completely, you can see which ones are real, and which ones only exist because someone assumed they were necessary." The simulation dissolved, leaving Sarah standing in the physical chamber with a satisfied smile. She had done more than beat the test. She had proven that the greatest human strength wasn't solving problems within defined parameters. It was the ability to step back and question whether those parameters were truly necessary at all. The emergency council meeting of the Galactic Institute of Higher Learning buzzed with unprecedented energy. Representatives from every major species packed the quantum-shifted amphitheater, their varied forms creating a living mosaic of galactic diversity. At the center stage, Professor Zix 427's scales had finally settled into a shade of deep contemplative blue after cycling through the entire known spectrum of academic crisis colors. "And you're certain the simulation was functioning correctly?" asked the Arch-Chancellor, her crystalline form refracting the question into 1,000 harmonious frequencies. "Perfectly," the professor replied, his voice harmonics carrying a new note of humility. "Every system performed exactly as designed. That was, ironically, the problem." Sarah Chen sat quietly in the front row, still making notes in her ever-present notebook. The professor found himself wondering, for the first time in his 3-century career, what a human might see when they looked at a problem. Not just the parameters and variables, but the spaces between them, the assumptions that shaped the very framework of their solutions. "Explain," commanded the Arch-Chancellor. The professor's scales shifted to analytical silver. The simulation was programmed to adapt to each species' natural capabilities, ensuring that challenges remained within the realm of possible solution paths. But it made one critical assumption, that we knew what those capabilities were. He gestured towards Sarah with a respectful appendage. "Humans, it seems, have a unique ability. They don't just solve problems within given parameters. They question the parameters themselves. When faced with a system of rules, they instinctively look for spaces those rules don't cover." "This is dangerous," rumbled a hive mind representative. "Rules exist for reasons. Structure maintains order." "Does it?" Sarah spoke up, closing her notebook. "Or does it just maintain our current understanding of order? The universe doesn't care about our rules. It operates according to principles we're still discovering." The amphitheater erupted in multilingual debate. The Symmetrians argued that without structured approaches, chaos would prevail. The Altharians' probability fields fluctuated wildly as they calculated potential outcomes. The hive mind representatives buzzed with collective concern. Professor Zix 427 raised all 4 eyes for attention. "Colleagues, consider this. For 3 centuries, I taught that perfect problem-solving required perfect logic. But what is logic except a set of rules we created to explain how things work? Student Chen didn't break my simulation. She revealed its hidden assumptions. By drawing a door in thin air." An Altharian flickered skeptically. "By recognizing that the simulation's rules were based on our expectations," the professor corrected, his scales shimmering with newfound insight. "We programmed it to adapt to each species' capabilities, but we defined those capabilities based on our own understanding. Humans, it seems, have evolved to look past such definitions." Sarah stood, holding up her notebook. "May I?" At the Arch-Chancellor's crystalline nod, she projected her sketches onto the hall's quantum display. "Look at the simulation chamber's architecture, its power distribution, its quantum processing arrays. Everything about it was perfectly designed, within certain assumptions about how problems should be solved." The assembled academics studied her drawings with multiple eyes, appendages, and sensory organs. The professor watched their reactions, seeing the moment of realization ripple through the crowd like a wave of enlightenment. But this means the Arch-Chancellor's crystalline form vibrated with excitement. Our entire approach to education might benefit from revision. Exactly. Sarah smiled. The greatest human strength isn't our technology or our intelligence. It's our ability to imagine things being different than they are. We look at boundaries and see doorways. We face impossibilities and wonder, what if? Professor Zix 427 scales shifted to the rare shade of revolutionary insight, which is why the Galactic Council was right to include humanity in our community. You don't just add another perspective, you challenge us to question our own. The implications rolled through the assembly like intellectual thunder. Centuries of teaching methodology would need to be reconsidered. New frameworks for problem-solving would have to be developed. Frameworks that didn't just accommodate human creativity, but learned from it. Student Chen. The professor's harmonics carried a note of profound respect. I designed my simulation to prove the superiority of structured logical thinking. Instead, you proved something far more valuable. That true innovation requires both logic and imagination, rules, and the courage to question them. Sarah made one final note in her notebook, then looked up with that characteristically human smile. That's the real test, isn't it, Professor? Not solving the problems we're given, but recognizing when we need to redefine the problems themselves. As the assembly dissolved into excited discussion about the future of galactic education, Professor Zix 427 found his scales settling into a completely new color, one that reflected not just acceptance of change, but enthusiasm for it. In trying to prove humanity's methods inferior, he had instead discovered a fundamental truth. The greatest breakthroughs often come not from following the rules perfectly, but from having the courage to ask why those rules exist in the first place. And somewhere in the vast expanse of space, humanity's star continued to rise, not because humans were stronger or smarter than other species, but because they never stopped looking at the impossible and asking, why not?